Certainly glad to see all of you this morning. Happy to have opportunity to worship God on the day made especially for His Son, and we're grateful that we can be together to do that. Our study is in John 4 this morning, and we'll turn to that in a moment, but our readings are now in Isaiah. If you have your reading schedule with you, you'll notice that Wednesday, the 27th, we had the Song of Solomon. And the Song of Solomon, in essence, is about fill in the blanks. Lee? Mm-hmm. Yes, the Shulamite, and then there's a girl who actually is in love with whom? Evidently a shepherd boy, yeah. And so marital love is a big part of it. Then in number 209 was Thursday, 10, 11. Yesterday would take us through the first 12 chapters of Isaiah. Isaiah writes about 750 and following, and he's writing also about the time that Jeroboam II was king in Israel, the northern kingdom. And as a result of that, things had gone fairly well financially, physically, nationally for Israel during the time that Jeroboam II was king, and as a result of that, the people had a sense of what? We're fine. What's wrong with us? What? Sense of what? Complacency, pride, and so throughout, especially those first 39 chapters of Isaiah, he talks about how, look, you're spiritually bankrupt, though financially they were doing well. In fact, during that time, earlier, during the time of Solomon, you remember, the land promise was, in Genesis 12, was primarily in the land of Canaan proper. During the days of Solomon, it extended, the subjugation land extended all the way to the Euphrates River. And then it had been pushed back during the times of Jeroboam II. We go over and we have subjugation of peoples and lands all the way over. So they felt like, hey, we're invincible. Everything's going well. But spiritually, they were bankrupt. And so the hypocrisy, ritualism, all those things that are so common in the prophets, the first 39 chapters primarily deal with how Assyria was going to be the rod of God's anger, the staff of His chastisement, chapter 10 shows, and the Assyrians were going to come in and take them captive, which they did. So that's where we are in those passages in Isaiah. There is just glance real quickly. In the first chapter of Isaiah, he mentions the fact that it's like a court scene, a court of law, and Israel is brought on as the defendant, and God is making accusations, the indictments against them. However, in a more commonly memorized passage, he says, it is not hopeless. Look at verse 18. Come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. But there's a condition. What? Verse 19. If you be willing and obedient. But, verse 20, if you refuse and rebel, ye shall be devoured with the sword, for the mouth of the Lord is spoken. And yet there's a time coming when the mountain of the Lord's house, look at 2, verse 2, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established in the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills. All nations shall flow into it. Well, of what does he speak? Establishment of the church, the Messianic age, Messianic kingdom. All nations will flow into it. And rather than being concerned about the Assyrians and others, They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and neither will they learn war anymore, because the nature of kingdom citizens is peacefulness. It reminds us of John 18:36, where Jesus told Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered up to the Jews. So in chapter 2, he goes on to talk about their idolatry. In chapter 4, there would be a remnant. In verse 2, 3, and 4, in that day, the branch of the Lord will come. In 5, the parable of the vineyard is given, and a number of judgments, woes. I was talking with a fellow yesterday that we had 5:20 is a parallel to what you see in our world today. Woe to them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. What the true reality of things is, people take what? Just the opposite, right, Farron? Just the opposite of what it is. In chapter 6, in the year King Uzziah was reigning, Isaiah sees the Lord here in his temple, and the Lord commissions him to go to his people, and he says, well, how long? And he says, well, basically till there's no more cities and villages, everything's devoured. But you preach your heart out and your head off, and you'll be doing my will. 7, 8, we continue with God's anger. Again, I'm just highlighting some things. In 10:5, I think that would be a good verse if you haven't highlighted it already, to highlight it. 10:5, Ho, Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, the staff in whose hand is mine indignation. I will send him against a profane nation. Who's the profane nation? Israel, yeah. And it shows that God could use and did use heathen people to accomplish bigger purposes of his. And that's significant, I think, in chapter 10. Yet while Assyria did that, if you drop down into verse, a little later in the chapter, he says that Assyria does not know, let's see, I didn't mark that, that they were not thinking they were doing God's will, but they were doing it anyway. That's in chapter 10. Yeah. That's it. Howbeit he meaneth not so. Thank you, sweetie. Neither doth his heart think so, but it is in his heart to destroy, to cut off nations. His desire was to be aggressive. That is, speaking, personifying Assyria. But anyway, that's a part of where we are in our readings. All right, let's stop there. We went through 12. We got some messianic passages in 9 as well as in 11. But let's go on into our study of the life of Christ. Hope the readings are continuing to help as we're going through them. All right, in our study of the life of Christ, Matthew wrote primarily for what kind of an audience? Jews. Mark, Romans, Luke, Hellenists, John, Greeks. And then what we find in the significance, the key words, thus it was fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven is emphasized in Matthew. Immediately, straightway, book of action. The humanity of Jesus is emphasized here. And of course, where we are now, Jesus' ability to even see into the mind of people, read the thoughts of people. We see that. Here we are, years of preparation. We have, tell me now, years of preparation. Luke 1, the birth of John. Luke 2, the birth of Jesus. Then we have Luke 3, the early work of John. And then the beginning ministry begins with Jesus what? Baptism. Immediately he went out to be tempted in the wilderness of Judea. And then after that, he comes in the first disciples in John, the first chapter, who are the 5, Andrew, and the unnamed disciple, John. Andrew goes and gets Peter. Then we have, as he's minded to go into Galilee, Philip. Then Philip goes and finds Nathanael. Good. All right, then we go into we leave that, and he goes to Cana, where he turns water to wine. And then we talked about that. Then to Capernaum for a brief time. Then he comes back to Jerusalem, and we have the first Passover. And what does he do there in the temple? He cleanses it. And he makes a prediction about his death, burial, and resurrection. They said, basically, by what authority do you do these things? Not in those words, but that was the essence. And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it again. And they said, well, 46 years has this temple been in the making, and how do you think you're going to do? Then the disciples understood later he was speaking of the temple of his body. Good. All right, and then at the end of 2, 23 through 25, I wanted to come back to that. I had this passage scanned out of my own Bible. Read this again with me. When he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, during the feast, that's the feast of the Passover, many believed on his name, beholding his signs which he did. What the signs were intended to cause belief. But Jesus did not trust himself into them. He did not commit himself because he knew all men. And because he needed not that anyone should bear witness concerning man, that is, he didn't have to have other men to tell him what these people were up to. He himself knew what was in man. And we made a point last week that you see that Nicodemus believes. It's almost like these verses are in anticipation of what we see in 3 and 4. Many believed, and Nicodemus is one of them. And he didn't have to tell people, he didn't have to have people tell him what others were thinking. He knew what was in. And when Jesus answered Nicodemus didn't even have a question, an oral question. He just made a declaration. We know that you're a teacher come from God. No one can do the signs you do except God be with. Jesus answered his thoughts, answered his question that he hadn't even asked, which indicates he knew what was in man. Now, when we talked about that in the rest of John 3. When we come to John 4, we're going to have the conversation with the woman at the well, and we're going to see the same thing. And in this case, whereas he was in 3, whereas he was reading the thoughts of Nicodemus, he knows the deeds of the woman. Come see a man who told me all I ever did. And so he knows the thoughts, he knows the deeds, and so that's where we were. Now, we talked Wednesday night about John rebuking Herod Antipas and is put in prison because of that. We showed who that was, how he was one of the sons of Herod the Great, and he had a brother, Herod Philip, who himself had Herodias and a daughter Salome. And then when this Herod Antipas had visited, he wooed Herodias to himself, and so John rebuked him for having his brother Philip. He says it's not what? Not lawful. Yeah. And we mentioned Wednesday night, if we can get this, that Brother McGarvey in his comments made the point that it was unlawful because the husband of Herodias was still living, and the lawful wife of Herod was still living. But that's if you superimpose the law of Christ on them then, which had Jesus even given the law of divorce, he hadn't done it. And the real reason it was unlawful was because Antipas over here, as well as Herodias, were nephew and niece. So hence it was unlawful by reason of consanguinity. In Leviticus 18, you could not have a nephew, a niece. You couldn't have an aunt, uncle. And it was unlawful due to the marriage to a brother's wife while the brother was still alive. So anyway, because of all of that, Herod has John what? Had him in prison. A little bit later, he's going to have, I think I heard you say that, he's going to have his head cut off. There you go. So now, on the way to Galilee, we're leaving Jerusalem environs and we're going up to Galilee. And in order to do that, he passes through Samaria. It's interesting. I know you've already read ahead. It says in, I think it's verse 5, that in going through Galilee, he must needs pass through Samaria. I think some of your newer translations will say he had to pass. Is that right? He had to pass through. Is that verse 5? 4. Yeah. He must needs pass through Samaria. He must needs. Now, that's an interesting idea here. The most direct route from Judea to Galilee, that's the Beige area, the most direct route is the way Jesus is going. You know, you have the King's Highway and other major highways, but that's not the way most Jews would travel. The Samaritans were a hated bunch, and so oftentimes they would cross the Jordan, go through Perea, and then come back across the Jordan into Galilee. What was from Jerusalem on up into Galilee about a 3-day journey becomes about a 7-day journey on this circuitous route. But he had to go through Samaria. Think outside the box just for a second. He could have gone the way most did, but why did he have to go through Samaria? Think what happens. There you go. Exactly fair, and that's exactly what I wanted you to think. He had to go through there if he were going to have that conversation with the woman. It's reminiscent of, remember when Paul and Silas were on the second journey, and Paul was minded to go through Bithynia, and the Spirit forbade them, and then they end up going over to Philippi, and who's converted in Acts 16? First it was Lydia and her house, and then the Philippian jailer. And so you have the Spirit knows whose hearts are ready to, God knows whose hearts are ready, who need the gospel. And so in His providence and in this specific direction, He had Jesus go straight up through Samaria. A lot of things I've thought about that I'd like to mention maybe in a lesson at some point. I will say this, that you go back to John 2:23 through 25, where He says, that many were believing on Him, but He did not commit Himself to them because He knew what was in man. And then you have the conversation with, think who He was now. He's a man, first of all. He's a ruler of the Jews. He's a religious man, which probably he was a moral man. He had been taught the law. And He comes to Jesus by night and has a question. All right. On the other hand, on chapter 4, it's not a man, it's a woman. Instead of being extremely religious, she is what? She's a-religious, without religion, or we would say she's a Samaritan, Instead of being moral, she's immoral. And yet Jesus deals with both of them. He deals with both of them to bring both of them. And I was telling Lee this morning, in a sense, He reprimands Nicodemus almost more than He does the woman. Aren't you a teacher in Israel, and don't you know these things? And Jesus was just trying to get her to come to faith in Him. In fact, one of the few times that Jesus has the self-identification, when she says, we know that when the Messiah comes, He will tell us all things. And Jesus then responds, I who speak unto thee am He. And so he's really saying that, I am He. You found Him. And so she leaves her water pot and goes into the city and tells everybody about Him. A lot of applications here, a lot to be learned. And as well as, and I couldn't help but think of this too, not in the notes. We think about, and I try to really deal with this and say it quite often. When we think about Jesus' life, God manifesting Himself through Christ, and then Christ giving us an example, 1 Peter 2, that we should walk in His steps. And I think here in John 3 and John 4, that we have really in the beginning ministry, we have the beginning of the life of Jesus that we can actually look into and get insight into what motivated Jesus in talking with these people. With Nicodemus, it's still, he's got to know you've got to be born again spiritually. With the woman, she's going to have to come to faith in him. And so he uses various means from going from the physical to the spiritual to try to bring her to understand who he really is. And we so many wonderful lessons that our motive needs to try to be turned to be like Jesus. That and we just now this fella in John 3 came to Jesus. In this sense, he came to the woman. At least he came to the well, and she happened to be there. And then he asked her for a drink. And so, can you help me out? And then turn water, the idea of the well, into spiritual water, spiritual drink, eternal life. So much as to using the mundane things of life and twisting them into a spiritual conversation. We can do that, if we're looking to do it. Okay, I know I'm just kind of talking around about where we are, but I think about that quite a bit. All right, we're at the bottom of 31, and we're down to here. Let's see. I wanted to do something else here. Oh, yeah, I wanted to show you a few pictures, and we'll get into the text itself. All right, as he goes from Judea up through Samaria, the region of Samaria, he's going to come very, very close to the city of Samaria. In fact, Sychar, I don't know if you can see on the map, here's Sychar, and there's Shechem. Did I say the city of Samaria? I meant Shechem. Here's Sychar and Shechem. Here's the city of Samaria there. And right there, smack dab in between two mountains, is the city of Shechem. Mount Gerizim, on which the blessings were to be read all the way back in Joshua 8. 6 tribes, we'll come back to it. Here's near Sychar, here's Shechem, and Mount Ebal is to the right. Mount Gerizim is over here to the left, and Shechem is in between there. Shechem is so significant. Where did God make the original land promise to Abraham? Genesis 12, 6 and 7. Shechem. Jacob bought a parcel of ground there at Shechem when he came back from his flight and with Esau. Joseph tells his family in Genesis 50, he says, when I die, I want you to carry after I die, I want you to carry my bones into the land that God has promised our fathers. Exodus 12, when they go out in the Passover, 13, they're carrying on their shoulders the sarcophagus of Joseph. And then when we get to Joshua 24, end of Joshua, let's turn over there. This is almost kind of spine-tingling to me. End of Joshua, chapter 24, as he concludes the book, Joshua dies in 29, 30, and 31. And look at 32. The bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in what? In Shechem. And the parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money, and they became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. And Eleazar the son of Aaron died, and they buried him in the hill of Phinehas. So the point made is we come full circle from the time God made the original land promise to Abraham, and then they move out of the land. Then eventually with Moses they come in. Then Joshua leads them, and then they're at Shechem. The law is read. The blessings and the curses. That's Joshua the 8th chapter. They're separated between the two mountains. The 6 tribes on one, 6 tribes on the other. Here is the Mount Ebal, the Mount of cursing, and then the Mount Gerizim would be behind. That's the little city of Shechem. So all that's going on. And so you think about the history of that little area, the Bible history, and Jesus is there. Brother McGarvey went over to, spent about 2 years over in Palestine. And after that, or during that time, he recorded in a diary all of his sights and even measurements. He got a tape measure. And he wrote a book that's called The Lands of the Bible. And it's still extremely profitable. I think I've got 2 copies of it. But anyway, here is Brother McGarvey was over there in the late 1800s. And this is a photograph that was taken in 1912 of the well itself. Now, Brother Jenkins took this photograph in 2012. There's a new Greek Orthodox church, or at least it was new then, over Jacob's Well. And here is the well itself in the, covered over by the church building. And so what we have then, Jesus comes there, and he's going to talk about a number of things. This is all in your notes. So, highly significant place historically for the Bible story, and Jesus is right there smack dab in the middle of it. Okay, comment or question? Anybody? All right, let's begin reading then. Chapter 4 of John. Let's begin in verse 5, and let's kind of do it like I've got it arranged here. Let's go 5 through 15. And how I noted it in my Bible, 5 and 6 is basically introduction. So he comes to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground Jacob gave to his son Joseph. We don't have that actually recorded in the book of Genesis. And Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. And there again, it's hard to know what hour of the day it was. If you use Jewish time, the 6th hour would be about noon. If it were Roman time, it would be probably 6 in the evening. If you counted the daylight at 12. If you counted it at beginning at midnight, it would be 6 a.m. in the morning. It would seem it would be either noon or 6 o'clock. But he's weary as well as what? Verse 7. He's thirsty. In a book that emphasizes his deity, what does this show? His humanity. That's right. David, why don't you read from there on, 8 through 15. All right, let me stop you right there for just a moment. The word life has been a commonly used word already. Remember, keep your finger there, go back a page or two to chapter 1, and notice in verse 4, in him was what? Life. And the light was the light of men. He is the life. Later he will say, I am the light of the world. And then he would say in chapter 10, thieves came, these other men have come that they might steal and destroy. But I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly. The abundant life. And so, but we have the word or the phrase everlasting life also used several times. We already saw it in 3, 15, 16, 17, all in there, everlasting life. And then the one other verse, David, 15. Okay, now first of all, let's go back and notice in verse 6. Jacob's well was there. being wearied, and he sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. And Jesus says, give me to drink. I want to notice with you, and I've got this in the notes a little bit later. Jesus will go from flesh, or we'll say physical matters, to what? To spiritual. He's going to go from flesh to the spiritual. Look at chapter 3. Well, remember in chapter 3. Except you be born, how? Born again. That which is born of the flesh is flesh. That which is born of the spirit is spirit. So he goes from the idea of a birth to a spiritual birth. Physical birth to a spiritual birth. Here, chapter 4, we've got the idea of water. And he says, if you knew the gift of God, you would ask me and I would give you living water that leads to eternal life. Right. Okay? Let's look at some of our notes on that. I just want to keep that in the back of your mind. And when we get down to another verse, I want to emphasize this. Look at some of our notes here on the bottom of page 31. H. Let's see. In order to go from Judea to Galilee, one had to pass through the region of Samaria. And I didn't say anything in the notes about what we did about, his purpose for going. Specifically, Jesus came to the city of Sychar, which was near the parcel of ground Jacob gave to his son. References to Genesis 33, Joshua 24. What about Jesus' humanity does John state? In verse 6, David answered a while ago. What is it? He was wearied from his journey and he asked for a drink. So he was tired. We'd say he was tired and thirsty. And you would think, to kind of flesh it all out, the Passover, think with me for a moment. The Passover has come and gone. True? Yeah, true. John 2, the Passover. That's March, April. Then we have the time that he is there in Jerusalem. Many believe so. It's possibly now it's May, June, warm weather. He's been walking. He's tired. He's likely hot, and he's thirsty. And so the woman comes to get water, and she's there, and he says, "Give me something to drink. Give me to drink." And she evidently is startled by that. What does she say? First of all, verse 8, his disciples. Now, keep in mind verse 8, and we're going to come back to that in the next paragraph, down in verse 27 and following. They're going to come back, and they've got food to eat, and he's more concerned with her conversion than he is eating a meal. We'll see that in a moment. But in verse 8, they went in to buy food, and verse 9, she's startled by his asking. She says what? Yeah, why are you asking? And then John parenthetically inserts there at the end of 9, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. I've got a question or two on that. If you'll notice on the top of page 32, while Jesus' disciples had gone to the city to buy what? Food or bread, a woman of Samaria came to the well to draw water, and he asked, saying, give me a drink. She's shocked that he would ask her such a question because usually Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. I've got a fairly lengthy note there that deals with why. The Samaritans, Samaria was the capital of what? Israel. And the Assyrians took the capital and all the Israelites captive and destroyed the capital city of Samaria in 722 when Hoshea was king, the last king in Israel. And then I've got in that first paragraph about 4 lines from the bottom of that paragraph. The poor were allowed to remain behind in the land. Later, foreigners from Babylon and surrounding territories were brought to the devastated region, who in turn intermarried with the remaining poor Israelites who had been left behind. This mixed population was given the name Samaritans after Samaria, founded by Omri, or Omri, some say. These colonists found very unfavorable conditions in the land, overrun by beasts, they believed to be the result of God's punishment. In time, they begged the monarch to send them an Israelitish priest who would teach them the law of God, and from these events, an adulterated form of Judaism was begun. There's a word for that, guys, that when you combine various religions together and you come out with kind of a mongrel religion, it's called syncretism. You're putting several things together and you're coming out with a different kind. That's what really the Samaritans were. And in the next paragraph, later, when a remnant of the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, they built the altar of burnt offering and laid the foundation of the temple that was to be rebuilt. Jealous Samaritans interrupted the work. Y'all remember that in our study not long ago. Those jealous Samaritans included who? Sanballat, yeah. Geshem, yeah. Tobiah, good, David. All those fellows, they were trying to overturn the good work that Nehemiah was doing. This was due to the fact they had earlier been refused permission to cooperate in the work of rebuilding in Nehemiah 4. Consequently, they hated the Jews, built their own temple on Mount Gerizim. This was destroyed by one of the Maccabean rulers, John Hyrcanus. However, worshipers continued to offer their sacrifices on the hill where their temple had stood. The woman to whom Jesus speaks refers to that. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain. That's Mount Gerizim. And your people say that in Jerusalem you ought to. What do you say about all that? The unfriendly feeling of Jews toward Samaritans is also seen in John 8:48. Samaritans' unfriendliness toward Jews is recorded in Luke 9. But it's noteworthy that Jesus' desire to save everyone crossed the boundaries of national hatred as seen in John 4. Also seen in Luke 9 and in the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think you can take this idea to the bank. Most of the time we have national enemies, and for the United States. And I'm reminded Burt Banks. Some of you who follow Alabama football remember he was a producer of the Alabama radio football. You remember that, Brother Gene, Burt Banks? And he had been on the Bataan Death March that the Japanese had in the Philippines. And anyway, long story. I'm going to make a point out of this. What happened was, he came back. He made it through. He came back and he did real well in Tuscaloosa. And he was really over the radio network at the time. And somebody, I think it was the guy who worked for BRC years ago, Doug Layton, was making the point that he said he rode with Burt Bank one time from one place to another, or was going to drive. And Doug Layton had a Toyota. You know where I'm going with this now. He had a Toyota. And Burt just about couldn't stand to get in it because it was made by the Japanese. And that hatred was foisted by what had happened to him way back. And that story stuck with me. And it's interesting that oftentimes the people who are within a country are not responsible for the decisions that the leaders make. Now, they can go along with it, yes, but oftentimes they don't know. They don't know what the leaders are thinking, oftentimes. And the people are, we don't know what our leaders are up to. We can see some things, but we don't know all the details. They don't tell us. If they did, it'd probably be a riot on their hands. But the thing is, most of the, people like we are, we're not responsible for everything the government does. We're certainly not responsible for the immorality and ungodliness. But so Jesus I say all that to say this, that Jesus sees through that, and here's a region where the Jews despised the people because of, what they were, where they were from and all that, their ancestry and their religion. And Jesus sees this woman as just an individual that he can try to bring to faith in him. And that's the way all of us ought to be. We ought not to look at people as our government wants people to do, as a class of people. You're either a minority or you're a majority. You've been oppressed or you're the oppressors. And so, if you're a white male, you're a part of the oppressive, white supremacy. I am? Because I'm a white man, white older guy? No. And that's class warfare, class envy, and all that. Jesus saw through all of that, and he dealt with each person on an individual basis. That is one of the greatest lessons we can learn from this, that we deal with people, regardless of what kind of baggage that they may have as a race of people, or just deal with that person on an individual basis, as if you don't know anything else about them. And that's what Jesus did. And that's what I said a while ago. He gave us an example that we should walk in his steps. And I think that's one of them. All right, let's move on. Jesus begins to shift her thinking to who he is. He tells her that if she knew the what? Number 6 here. The gift of God. Speaking of it, she would be asking for living water. Irony of these words, had she understood that though Jesus physically was the object of her goodness, he needed a drink of water. Spiritually, their cases were reversed, and she was the object of his goodness. I think I was telling Lee earlier this morning, it reminds me of 2 Corinthians 9, the last verse. Paul says, but thanks be to God for his unspeakable gift. And here he just calls himself the gift of God. Did she understand the spiritual shift in his words? Number 7. No. Jesus again shifts from her misunderstanding that he spoke of physical water to the spiritual. He said that everyone who drinks of this physical water shall what? Thirst again. But whoever drinks the water that he gives shall never thirst. In fact, that kind of water he refers to is that which will spring up into everlasting or eternal life. She grasped only a vague idea that whatever Jesus offered was special and she wanted it. However, she still thought that Jesus spoke of what? Physical water, because she said, oh, if that's the case, give me that I won't have to do what? I won't have to come here and draw water any longer. Yeah, she's still thinking of physical water. All right, now, in 16, we got about a minute. In 16 through 18, Jesus evidently understands, this has kind of come to a dead end in this part of the conversation. So he says, he discusses her marital status. What does he say? Well, 16 through 18. Who read? I just picked on somebody a while ago. Was it you? Robin, if you would, 16 through 18. All right, so he tells her about her marital status that she did not even reveal. Well, she then wants to change subjects. Then, James, if you would read for us 19 through 24, and this is where we begin. She wants to talk about worship. Let's talk about something besides my marital life. All right, we're running out of time. What I want you to consider, though, is he tells her of her marital situation. And then she says, well, let's talk about something different, like worship. She says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you say in Jerusalem. Jesus said, I'll tell you, the time is coming when they will not say here of Jerusalem. For God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in what? Spirit and in truth. What we have here is, I take it to be, he moves from the flesh to the spirit, as we see in these discussions, and it's like flesh versus spirit. And over here you've got the types. or shadows of the Old Testament versus the substance, S-U-B-S-T-A-N-C, substance, or we'll say the truth. So you've got spirit and truth in contrast to the flesh, whether it be on Mount Gerizim or in Jerusalem, and the types in the tabernacle and the temple and all that in comparison to the truth. So you have the substance in worshiping with the truth, and the spirit, one's own spirit from the flesh. Our time is short. We'll have to maybe talk a little bit more about that Wednesday night. I think that's really the point he makes. I make it a point in the note that oftentimes people, and I grew up hearing this, and I've said it myself, that people will say spirit and truth, spirit is from one's heart, and truth is according to the Word of God. Well, that's true in that that's how we ought to worship. But I think the contrast is not that. I think the flesh is the spirit is in contrast to the flesh, and truth is in contrast to the types and shadows of the Old Testament. I think that more or less, and we'll maybe talk about that some more Wednesday night. Okay, thank you for your